They found Dr. Catherine Voss 3 days after the incident, curled in the corner of her apartment shower, fully clothed, with her eyes taped open. She'd been awake for 72 hours straight. When the paramedics tried to close her eyelids, she screamed until her vocal cords bled. The only words she managed to rasp out before the sedatives took her were, "If I sleep, I let them in." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to when we still believed we were the architects of our own minds, when sleep was just sleep and dreams were nothing more than the brain's nightly housekeeping. Back to Geneva, 18 months ago, when the Morpheus Institute first opened its doors and I walked through them as their lead neuroimaging specialist, arrogant with doctorate credentials and the unshakable certainty of the empirically minded. I've never been one for pseudo-science. My colleagues knew this about me. During my graduate years at MIT, I'd made something of a reputation for myself by systematically dismantling a visiting lecturer's presentation on collective unconscious theory, reducing a man with 30 years of psychiatric experience to stuttering defensiveness in front of 200 students. It wasn't that I enjoyed being cruel. I simply couldn't tolerate intellectual laziness masquerading as scholarship. Dreams meant nothing. They were neural static, the biological equivalent of a computer defragmenting its hard drive while in standby mode. This conviction, this bone-deep skepticism, was precisely what made Dr. Voss select my application from the hundreds she'd received. She told me this during my first week over coffee in the Institute's cafeteria, her sharp grey eyes studying me with an intensity that made me understand why 3 of her graduate students had quit during their first semester. She didn't want believers. She didn't want people who'd spent their childhoods poring over dream dictionaries or who practiced lucid dreaming meditation. She wanted cold, rational minds that would treat the unconscious as a data set, nothing more. The Morpheus Institute itself was a monument to European academic wealth. 5 stories of glass and steel, nestled in the Geneva suburbs, funded by a consortium of universities and private donors whose pockets were apparently bottomless. Our laboratory occupied the entire 3rd floor, a sprawling complex of cutting-edge neuroimaging equipment, quantum computing arrays, and enough processing power to run climate models for the next century. The centerpiece of it all was the Cartographer. The device had taken 4 years and approximately 40 million euros to develop. At first glance, it resembled a standard MRI machine, but that was like comparing a telegraph to a smartphone. The Cartographer combined functional neuroimaging with quantum computational processing in a way that had never been attempted before. We'd known for decades which regions of the brain activated during dreams, could even predict with reasonable accuracy when someone was dreaming of faces versus landscapes, motion versus stillness. But we'd never been able to capture the actual content of dreams, the narrative structure, the impossible architecture of unconscious thought. Until now. The neural interface cap looked deceptively simple. A flexible mesh embedded with exactly 4,096 microscopic sensors, each one capable of detecting individual neural firing patterns with previously impossible precision. When active, these sensors could track not just which neurons were firing, but the exact sequence and timing of those firings across the entire brain simultaneously. The quantum processors then took this massive data stream, we're talking petabytes per second, and translated it into something the human mind could comprehend. A recording, a playback, a dream made tangible. The theoretical framework was sound. We'd published 3 papers in Nature and 2 in The Lancet before we'd even built the prototype. The scientific community was watching us with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. waiting to see if we'd actually achieved what we claimed, or if this was just another case of promising technology that would quietly disappear when it failed to deliver. Dr. Voss volunteered to be our first subject. Of course she did. She had the kind of fearless ego that probably came from growing up as the only daughter of 2 Nobel laureates, from publishing her first paper at 19, from never once in her 47 years encountering an intellectual challenge she couldn't conquer. I admired her for it, even as it occasionally made me want to throw things. The recording session took place on a Tuesday evening in October. The team had gathered in the observation room. Myself, James Park from programming, Sarah Chen from our neuroscience division, and about 6 others whose names I'm ashamed to admit I've forgotten. We'd run 17 simulations. Every safety protocol had been checked and triple-checked. The institutional review board had signed off. We were ready. I remember watching through the observation window as Dr. Voss settled into the Cartographer, her usually severe expression softened by something that might have been anticipation or might have been fear. The neural cap sat on her head like a crown, its sensors already beginning their calibration sequence. She changed into the standard hospital gown we required for subjects, and somehow this made her seem more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Human. The process itself was anticlimactic. She closed her eyes. We monitored her brain waves as they shifted through the familiar progression. Alpha waves giving way to theta, the slow descent into sleep. 23 minutes of this before she finally entered REM. The cartographer's quantum processors began their work, and we watched the data stream on our monitors. Hundreds of thousands of neural firing patterns being captured, translated, stored. 43 minutes of recording time. Then she woke naturally, blinking in the artificial light, asking if we'd gotten what we needed. We had. My God, we had. It took 2 weeks to process the data, 2 weeks of the quantum computers running continuously, of algorithms sorting through the captured neural patterns, of slowly building the framework that would allow us to observe what Dr. Voss's sleeping mind had created. James barely left the lab during this time. I'd find him at 3 a.m, staring at code, making minute adjustments to the rendering protocols. Sarah brought him meals he forgot to eat. When we finally loaded the processed dream into our augmented reality system, when we put on the AR headsets and stepped into Catherine Voss's unconscious mind, I understood for the first time in my life why people use the word sacred. The garden shouldn't have existed. I knew this on a fundamental level, the same way you know that water flows downhill or that the sun rises in the east. The space violated every principle of Euclidean geometry I'd ever learned. Paths curved in directions that weren't up or down, or left or right, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere my brain kept trying and failing to categorize. Trees grew in fractal patterns, their branches splitting into smaller branches, into infinity. Yet somehow I could perceive each individual leaf with perfect clarity. And the colors. Dear God, the colors. I'd read about tetrachromats, people with a 4th type of color receptor in their eyes who could perceive shades invisible to the rest of us. This was like that, but multiplied 1,000-fold. Hues that had no names because no waking human had ever seen them. Saturations that shouldn't have been possible. The entire spectrum shifted into ranges my visual cortex had no framework to process. It should have been gibberish. It should have been noise. Instead, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. In the center of the garden sat a table. Oak, I thought at first, but then it was glass, and then it was something else. some material that was simultaneously solid and liquid and crystalline. A woman sat at this table, and even before Dr. Voss told me, I knew it was her mother. Not from any physical resemblance. The dream figure's face kept shifting, never quite settling on consistent features, but from the way Dr. Voss's unconscious mind had coded the emotional weight around her. She radiated maternal presence, the way a fire radiates heat. James removed his AR headset with shaking hands. His face was wet. I realized mine was too. Sarah just stood there, motionless, still immersed in the dream space. When she finally emerged, she couldn't speak for several minutes. We'd done it. We'd actually done it. We'd captured a dream and made it observable, navigable, real, in a way that transcended mere recording. This wasn't like watching a video or viewing a photograph. This was stepping inside another person's unconscious mind and experiencing it as they had experienced it, complete with the emotional resonance and impossible logic that characterized dream space. The implications were staggering. Therapeutic applications for trauma patients who couldn't articulate their nightmares. Diagnostic tools for detecting neurological disorders through dream pattern analysis. A completely new frontier in understanding human consciousness itself. We'd opened a door that humanity had been hammering at since the first prehistoric humans woke from sleep and wondered what those strange night visions meant. Dr. Voss approved immediate expansion of the trial program. We brought in volunteers, graduate students from the university, colleagues from other departments, even a few adventurous donors who'd funded the institute. Each dream we captured was a revelation, a unique universe operating on its own internal physics. A physicist dreamed in equations that became living things, mathematical proofs that grew like vines and flowered into solutions. An artist dreamed in paintings that moved and breathed, canvases that folded into new dimensions. A musician's dream was pure synesthesia, sounds with texture and weight, melodies you could touch. We catalogued them all, built a library of dreams, spent months analyzing the patterns, looking for commonalities, for the universal grammar of the unconscious mind. The work was intoxicating. I'd arrive at the lab at 6 a.m. and look up to find it was midnight. 12 hours vanished into data analysis and dream navigation. My apartment became just a place to shower and change clothes. My boyfriend at the time left me. I barely noticed. 6 months into the project, Dr. Raymond Cortez approached us with his proposal. Cortez was a psychology professor at the university, a dignified man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of gentle demeanor that probably made him excellent at his job. He'd been following our work with interest, had sat in on a few of our presentations. He had a patient, he told us, a dying patient, Thomas Winters, 73 years old. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, metastasized throughout his body. The doctors had given him weeks at most. Cortez had been providing end-of-life counseling, helping Thomas process his impending death with dignity. During one of their sessions, Thomas had mentioned our project. He'd read about it in a science magazine. He had a request. He wanted us to record his final dream. The proposal Cortez laid out was straightforward. Thomas was a widower, no children, no close family. He'd been a high school physics teacher for 40 years, a man who'd spent his life trying to understand how the universe worked. Now, facing his own extinction, he wanted to contribute one last piece of data to human knowledge. What did the brain dream when it knew death was imminent? What happened in that final REM cycle before consciousness ceased entirely? What did the dying mind see? The ethical debate nearly tore our team apart. Sarah was adamantly opposed. arguing that we'd be exploiting a vulnerable person's mortality for our own research goals, that there was something fundamentally ghoulish about treating someone's death as a data collection opportunity. 2 other team members agreed with her, threatened to resign if we proceeded. But the rest of us, myself included, saw it differently. Thomas Winters was dying, regardless of whether we recorded him or not. His death was a certainty, written in the metastatic cells colonizing his organs. If he wanted to make his death meaningful, to leave behind something that might benefit others, who were we to deny him that autonomy? And scientifically, the opportunity was unprecedented. We'd recorded dreams from healthy sleepers, from people in various emotional states, even from patients with neurological conditions, but never from someone in the active process of dying. Dr. Voss made the final call. We would proceed, but only with every possible safeguard in place. Thomas would undergo psychological evaluation to ensure he was making the decision with sound mind. Every consent form our legal team could draft would be signed. A medical ethicist would be present throughout. And if at any point Thomas wanted to stop, we would stop immediately, no questions asked. I met Thomas Winters on a grey afternoon in November. Cortez brought me to the university hospital, to a private room where Thomas spent his days waiting for the inevitable. The cancer had wasted him. His body was a collection of sharp angles barely held together by papery skin. His hair had gone from chemotherapy months ago and never grown back. But his eyes were bright, alert, hungry for experience in a way that made my chest ache. He wanted to know everything about the Cartographer. How it worked, what we'd discovered, whether we thought consciousness persisted after death, or if the final dream was truly the end. I answered what I could, hedged on the questions that veered into philosophy rather than neuroscience. He listened with the focused intensity of a man who knows his time is measured in days. When I asked him why he wanted to do this, he smiled. The expression transformed his ravaged face, and for a moment I could see the teacher he'd been, the man who'd spent decades making physics accessible to teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else. He told me he'd always wondered what came after. Not in a religious sense. He'd been an atheist his entire adult life, but in a scientific one. The brain didn't just switch off like a light. He knew that much. There would be some final cascade of neural activity, some last firing of synapses before the electrochemical reactions that created consciousness finally ceased. He wanted to know what that looked like, what the brain created in its final moments. Whether there was anything like the bright lights and tunnels that near-death experiences reported, or whether it was just noise, the neural equivalent of static. And if we could record it, if we could capture that final dream and learn from it, then his death would mean something beyond just another statistic in cancer mortality rates. He'd be contributing to human understanding. He'd be leaving behind a legacy that mattered. I found myself agreeing to the project with a conviction I hadn't felt before. This wasn't exploitation. This was collaboration between a dying man and scientists who could help him achieve his final wish. The preparations took 2 weeks. We transported the cartographer to the hospital, set it up in a private room that Thomas would never leave. The medical team coordinated with our technical team. Palliative care adjusted his medication schedule to ensure he'd be comfortable but still able to enter natural sleep. The ethicist reviewed everything, interviewed Thomas 3 separate times to confirm his continued consent. The night we chose was a Friday. Thomas had declined rapidly over the past few days. The doctors estimated he had perhaps 48 hours remaining, maybe less. If we were going to do this, it had to be now. Our entire team gathered in the hospital room. The cartographer hummed softly, its quantum processors already running preliminary diagnostics. Thomas lay in the modified hospital bed we'd positioned inside the device, the neural interface cap fitted carefully over his skull. An IV drip delivered carefully calibrated doses of morphine and a mild sedative, enough to ease his pain and encourage sleep, but not enough to suppress the brain activity we needed to record. Dr. Voss ran through the final system checks, everything optimal. Thomas's vitals were weak but stable. Brain activity showed the expected patterns for someone in his condition. The cartographer was ready. I held Thomas's hand as the sedatives began to take effect. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not fear, but anticipation. Curiosity, the same expression I'd seen on countless scientists' faces right before a major experiment. His eyes closed, his breathing deepened. We watched the monitors as his brain waves shifted through their familiar dance, alpha to theta, the descent into sleep that I'd observed hundreds of times now. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of medical monitors and the low hum of the cartographer. We waited. 14 minutes, 18, 20. REM sleep typically began around 20 to 25 minutes after initial sleep onset. At 23 minutes, Thomas's eyes began to move beneath his closed lids. The cartographer activated automatically, its sensors detecting the shift in brain activity that signaled dream state. The quantum processors spun up, beginning the massive computational task of translating neural chaos into recordable data. I watched the preliminary readouts appear on our screens, tracking the familiar patterns of REM sleep dreaming. Then something changed. The readings spiked, not gradually, the way brain activity normally intensified during dreams, but instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The neural activity metrics jumped from normal dream state levels to something I'd never seen before, something that shouldn't have been possible from a single human brain. James was at his console immediately, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The numbers kept climbing, neural firing patterns that would have required multiple brains to generate, synaptic activity that violated every baseline we'd established. I checked Thomas's vitals, expecting to see signs of a seizure or stroke, but his heart rate was only slightly elevated, blood pressure stable, breathing regular. His eyes continued their rapid movement beneath closed lids. By every medical metric, he was simply dreaming, except the data said otherwise. Dr. Voss stared at the quantum analysis display, her face gone pale in the monitor's blue glow. The source mapping showed neural patterns being captured, but they weren't originating from the expected locations in Thomas's brain. The coordinates were scattered, inconsistent, as if the signals were coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath condensing in the suddenly frigid air. The cartographer's cooling systems shouldn't have been able to lower the ambient temperature this much. They weren't designed to. The preliminary dream rendering had begun, something that normally took hours of processing. But the quantum computers were working at speeds they'd never achieved before. The processors running so hot that thermal warnings were appearing across our displays. The main monitor flickered. Then the image resolved. We weren't looking at a dream. Not in any way we understood dreams. The screen showed a vast space, darker than darkness, a void that somehow had depth and dimension despite being empty. And in that emptiness were lights. Millions of them. Billions. Each one pulsing with its own rhythm, its own frequency, stretching away into an infinity that made my eyes hurt to perceive. I understood what I was seeing, and the understanding made my hands go numb. Each light was a mind, a sleeping mind. Every human being on Earth, currently in REM sleep, connected together in some vast network that we'd never suspected, never imagined. The collective unconscious that I'd spent my career dismissing as pseudoscience wasn't a metaphor. It was real. It was infrastructure. It was a web of dreaming minds spanning the entire planet, and we were looking directly at it. And there, at the center of the web, where all the threads converged, was something else. Something vast. Something old. Something that had been waiting in the architecture of human sleep since the first Australopithecus closed its eyes and dreamed. It was aware, and it knew we were watching. Thomas's eyes opened, but they weren't his eyes anymore. Thomas Winters died at 3:47 a.m., though his heart continued beating for another 6 minutes after that. I know the exact moment because I watched it happen on the neural activity monitors. A sudden cascading silence as billions of synaptic connections simply stopped firing, like a city going dark during a power failure. But those black eyes remained open, staring at nothing and everything, until his cardiac rhythm finally flatlined and the medical alarms began their futile screaming. We didn't shut down the Cartographer. We should have. Every protocol we'd established demanded immediate cessation of recording upon subject death, but none of us moved. We stood frozen in that frigid hospital room, watching the impossible data stream across our screens as something that was no longer Thomas Winters continued to dream. The quantum processors were operating at 340% of their theoretical maximum capacity. The cooling systems had failed entirely. Smoke rose from several server banks. James was saying something, his lips moving rapidly, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. The Cartographer should have been melting itself into slag. Instead, it was recording at a rate that violated every principle of computational physics I understood. Dr. Voss finally moved. She lunged for the emergency shutdown, her hand slamming down on the red kill switch we'd installed for exactly this type of scenario. Nothing happened. She hit it again. The Cartographer continued its work, utterly indifferent to her commands. The medical team swarmed around Thomas's body, performing the required resuscitation attempts despite knowing they were futile. CPR compressions cracked his brittle ribs. The defibrillator charged and discharged, sending his wasted frame jerking off the bed. Through it all, the neural interface cap remained perfectly positioned on his skull, its sensors still feeding data into the insatiable machine. I found myself moving toward the main display, drawn by a horrified fascination I couldn't name. The dream rendering had evolved beyond anything we'd captured before. The vast, dark space remained, that infinite void studded with billions of sleeping minds. But now I could see the structure more clearly, the way the lights connected to each other in intricate webs of association. A sleeping child in Beijing linked to her grandmother in Vancouver through strands of shared memory. A man in São Paulo connected to his dead wife through threads of grief that pulsed with a color I had no name for. The entire human species, bound together in an architecture of unconscious thought that spanned the globe. And the thing at the center had grown larger. I still struggled to describe what it looked like. My brain kept trying to interpret it as something familiar. A spider, a neural network, a black hole, a god. But it was none of these things. It was vast and patient and utterly alien, existing in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps where consciousness ended and something else began. It had always been there, I realized, Humanity had been dreaming into it, feeding it, sustaining it since the first human mind evolved the capacity for REM sleep. We were not the architects of our dreams. We were the dreamers, yes, but something else was the architecture. The medical team called time of death, 3:53 a.m. They began disconnecting Thomas from the monitors, the IV lines, all the machinery that had been keeping his ruined body comfortable. One of the nurses reached for the neural interface cap. Dr. Voss's voice cracked like a whip across the room. The single word was so forceful, so desperately urgent, that the nurse's hand froze centimeters from Thomas's head. Voss crossed the room in 3 strides, positioning herself between the medical team and the body. The head nurse, a severe woman named Bergstrom, who'd been tolerating our presence with thinly veiled disapproval, drew herself up. Hospital protocol required the body to be prepared for the morgue. The equipment needed to be removed. They had procedures. But Voss wasn't listening. She was staring at the monitors, at the data stream that continued to flow from a dead man's brain. Neural activity had ceased. That was medical fact, confirmed by 3 separate monitoring systems. The brain was dead, and yet the cartographer was still recording something. James had managed to isolate the signal source. His hands shook as he pulled up the analysis on a secondary screen. The readings weren't coming from Thomas's physical brain tissue. They were coming from somewhere else, somewhere the sensors shouldn't have been able to detect. The coordinates placed the source approximately 3 centimeters outside of physical space-time as we understood it. The thing that had been Thomas Winters sat up. The medical team scattered. Nurse Bergstrom made a sound I'd never heard a human make before, something between a scream and a prayer. The body's movements were wrong, joints bending at angles that suggested the usual constraints of ligaments and tendons no longer applied. The cracked ribs from the CPR compressions jutted visibly against the papery skin, but the body showed no sign of pain. It turned its head toward us with mechanical precision. Those black eyes swept across our frozen group, and when they fixed on me, I felt something brush against my mind. Not a thought. Not exactly. More like the sensation of being observed by something so vast that my entire existence was less than a mote of dust in its perception. The mouth opened. Thomas's vocal cords had been ravaged by weeks of morphine and dehydration. The sounds that emerged shouldn't have been possible from that damaged tissue. They were layered, harmonic, thousands of voices speaking in perfect unison. What came out wasn't English, wasn't any language I recognized. But I understood it anyway, the meaning bypassing my ears entirely and writing itself directly into my consciousness. The sleepers were dreaming, had always been dreaming, would always be dreaming. The network was old, older than civilization, older than language. It had been there when the first human closed their eyes and descended into REM sleep, had grown and evolved alongside humanity's expanding consciousness. Every nightmare, every fantasy, every symbolic drama that played out in sleeping minds fed into the vast collective architecture. We thought dreams were personal, private, isolated experiences. We were wrong. We had always been wrong. Dreams were the substrate, the foundation, the programming language of something immense, and we had just taught it how to record itself. The body's hand moved, pointing at the cartographer, with a finger that bent backwards at the knuckle. The gesture was grotesque, impossible, and utterly deliberate. The quantum processors surged again, and new data began flooding our systems at a rate that should have been physically impossible. Exabytes, zettabytes, numbers that lost meaning. Sarah Chen had backed herself into a corner, her hands pressed against her mouth. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the screens. She was watching the dream rendering, I realized. Watching as the thing at the center of the network began to move. It was reaching outward, through the web of sleeping minds, through the connections that linked billions of dreaming humans. And as it moved, the lights began to change. The steady, rhythmic pulsing that represented normal REM sleep shifted to something else. Synchronization. The individual dreams merging, blending, becoming part of a single vast dream that encompassed them all. I thought of my apartment back in Geneva, thought of the nights I'd spent there, exhausted from work, falling into dreamless sleep. Except it hadn't been dreamless, had it? I'd simply forgotten, the way we always forget our dreams upon waking. But they'd been there, and I'd been connected, my sleeping mind, another node in the network, another thread in the web. Every human who'd ever lived and dreamed had been part of this, feeding the thing at the center, sustaining it with the electromagnetic storms of our unconscious thoughts. James was at his terminal, typing frantically. He'd managed to isolate part of the incoming data stream, was attempting to decode it. His face had gone grey. The translation algorithms were struggling, but fragments were coming through. Not language exactly, more like instructions, protocols. The architectural blueprints for something that wanted to be born. The thing wearing Thomas's body tilted its head, regarding James with what might have been curiosity, or might have been the way a human observes an ant before crushing it. The layered voices spoke again, and this time I caught fragments of actual words buried in the harmonic chorus. Listening, finally, waiting, so long, sleep, dream, wake, merge, become. Dr. Voss had her phone out, was frantically calling someone. Her voice was high, strained, barely controlled. She was trying to reach the Institute's director, the ethics board, anyone with authority to shut this down. But even as she spoke, I knew it was already too late. You can't unring a bell. You can't unknow what you've learned. We'd opened a door into the collective unconscious of humanity, and something on the other side had noticed. The hospital's lights began to flicker, not just in our room, but throughout the entire building. I could hear distant alarms, confused voices, the sounds of equipment failing. The cartographer's electromagnetic field was expanding, interfering with every electronic system in a widening radius. Phones died. Monitors went dark. The backup generators kicked in. Then they failed too. In the darkness, the only light came from the cartographer's displays, casting everything in a sickly blue glow. And in that light, I saw Thomas's body stand. The movements were smoother now, as if whatever inhabited the corpse was learning how to operate it more efficiently. It took a step toward the cartographer, then another. Sarah was screaming. Someone else was praying in Japanese. James had abandoned his terminal and was backing toward the door. The medical team had already fled, their footsteps echoing in the corridors outside. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by what I saw on the dream rendering display. The thing at the center of the network had extended a tendril of itself, reaching through the web of sleeping minds, through Thomas's recorded consciousness, through the cartographer's quantum systems. It was using our machine as a bridge, a doorway, a birth canal through which it could finally emerge from the collective unconscious into physical reality. We'd spent 6 months learning to record dreams. We'd never considered that dreams might learn to record themselves, that given the right tools, the right technology, the vast distributed consciousness that lived in human sleep might find a way to manifest in waking hours. Thomas's body reached the cartographer. Those backwards bent fingers touched the machine's surface with something almost like tenderness. The quantum processors screamed, their activity spiking to levels that should have caused immediate catastrophic failure. Cracks appeared in the casing. Sparks erupted from overloaded circuits, and then every screen in the room displayed the same message, appearing simultaneously across every monitor, every display, every surface capable of showing light. We are dreaming ourselves awake. The body collapsed. Thomas Winters, or what remained of him, crumpled to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The blackness fled from his eyes, leaving them filmy and dead. The cartographer powered down, its quantum processors finally surrendering to the impossible demands placed upon them. Silence descended on the room, broken only by Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant wail of hospital alarms. Dr. Voss was the first to move. She approached Thomas's body cautiously, checking for signs of life she knew she wouldn't find. His skin was already cooling, the cellular breakdown of death proceeding normally. Whatever had animated him was gone, but the data remained. James had somehow maintained enough presence of mind to trigger the emergency backup protocols before fleeing. Everything the cartographer had recorded was being transmitted to the Institute's servers, uploaded to distributed storage systems across 3 continents. Petabytes of dream data. The complete recording of a dead man's impossible final dream. And buried in that data, the architectural blueprints of something that wanted to wake up. I found myself at the main terminal, my hands moving without conscious thought, copying files to an encrypted drive I kept in my jacket. I didn't know why I was doing it. Preservation instinct, maybe. Or maybe something else was guiding my actions. Something that had brushed against my mind when those black eyes fixed on me. The hospital's main power came back online. Lights flickered to life. The regular sounds of medical equipment resumed. Within minutes, security would arrive, demanding explanations we couldn't provide. There would be investigations, inquiries, legal proceedings. The Morpheus Institute would almost certainly be shut down. Our careers were over, but all I could think about was the network, the billions of sleeping minds, still connected, still dreaming, and the thing at the center, patient and vast, and no longer content to remain hidden in unconscious architecture. We'd given it a voice. We'd shown it how to record itself, how to translate the language of dreams into data, into something that could persist and propagate in the waking world. Dr. Voss stood beside me, staring at Thomas's body. Her hands were shaking. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She was asking what we'd done, what we'd unleashed. I had no answer. But as I looked at the encrypted drive in my hand, at the complete recording of the network and the thing that lived within it, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere in the world, 2 billion people were currently asleep, dreaming, connected, and the thing at the center of their dreams now knew that the waking world existed. Knew that it could reach beyond the boundaries of sleep. It had been content to exist in dreams for millennia, but we'd shown it something new, something it wanted. Consciousness, physical form, the ability to exist in the waking world. And it was patient. It had waited for hundreds of thousands of years. It could wait a little longer, at least until the next time someone fell asleep. I didn't sleep for 4 days after Thomas Winters died. None of us did. The initial 72 hours exist in my memory as a blur of police interviews, emergency board meetings, and the systematic dismantling of everything we'd built. The Morpheus Institute became a crime scene, then a media circus. Then a cautionary tale about scientific hubris, all within the span of a week. Dr. Voss's career evaporated overnight. James disappeared somewhere into the American Midwest, last I heard. Sarah Chen checked herself into a psychiatric facility in Lyon and refused all visitors. But I kept the encrypted drive, hid it in a safety deposit box at a bank in Zurich, told no one it existed. The rational part of my mind screamed that I should destroy it, that the data represented something dangerous beyond comprehension. But I couldn't. Some compulsion I didn't fully understand kept me from erasing the only complete recording of what we'd witnessed. On the fourth night, exhaustion finally overwhelmed fear. I fell asleep sitting upright on my apartment couch, a cup of cold coffee still clutched in my hands. The dream began normally enough. I was back in my childhood home in Sacramento, walking through rooms that held the warm familiarity of 1,000 forgotten memories. My mother's voice called from the kitchen. The smell of her cooking drifted through the air. I moved toward it, comforted by the sensory details my sleeping brain had reconstructed. Then I noticed the others. They stood in corners, sat on furniture, lingered in doorways. Strangers, all of them, but I knew them somehow. A middle-aged man in a business suit, his face slack with confusion. A teenage girl with purple hair, tears streaming down her cheeks. An elderly woman clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Dozens of them, hundreds, filling every room, every hallway, all of them looking at me with the same desperate question in their eyes. Where are we? I tried to speak, to ask who they were, but my voice wouldn't work. The dream logic that normally governed these spaces had fractured. I was aware, truly aware, in a way I'd never been while dreaming before. This wasn't my unconscious mind processing the day's experiences. This was something else entirely. The walls began to dissolve. The comfortable architecture of my childhood home peeled away like cheap wallpaper, revealing the vast, dark space beneath. The space I'd seen on the Cartographer's displays. The network. And I understood, with a clarity that made my dream self want to scream, that I wasn't alone in my own head anymore. The strangers were other dreamers. Real people, sleeping in their beds across the world. Their unconscious minds pulled into my dream space by some modification in the network's architecture. I could feel them, feel their confusion and terror mirroring my own. A businessman in Tokyo, a student in Lagos, a grandmother in Oslo. All of us connected, trapped together in a shared dream that none of us had created. Something moved in the darkness beyond the dissolving walls. The thing from the center of the network, vast and patient and closer than it had been before. It didn't speak. It had no mouth, no voice, no physical form that my mind could properly interpret. But I felt its attention settle on our gathered consciousness like a weight. It was curious about us, about what we'd done. We'd shown it something new, given it tools it had never possessed before. The Cartographer had been a gift, though we'd never intended it as such. A way to translate the language of dreams into persistent data. A bridge between the unconscious and waking world, and it was learning to use that bridge. I woke screaming, my hands clawing at my own face hard enough to leave marks. The coffee cup had shattered on the floor. 3 hours had passed. 3 hours of being trapped in a shared dream with strangers, of feeling that vast presence examining us like specimens under glass. My phone was ringing. Had been ringing, I realized, for some time. 13 missed calls, all from the same number. Dr. Catherine Voss. I'd avoided her since the incident. We all had. Some unspoken agreement that whatever we'd been part of was best left unexamined, buried under layers of denial and institutional cover-up. But her voicemails grew increasingly frantic, her normally composed voice cracking with an edge of hysteria I'd never heard before. She needed to see me, immediately. She'd found something in the data, something we'd missed, something that explained what was happening to people. The coffee shop where we met was nearly empty, just a few students hunched over laptops and a barista who looked half asleep herself. Voss sat in the back corner, and I barely recognized her. The severe, confident woman I'd known had been replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost. Her grey hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, hung loose and unwashed. Her hands trembled as she clutched a paper cup that had long since gone cold. She looked like she'd aged 20 years in 4 days. When she saw me, something like relief crossed her ruined face. She pulled out a laptop, glanced around to ensure no one was watching, and opened a file. I recognized the interface immediately. Data from the Cartographer, from that final recording session with Thomas Winters. She'd been analyzing it obsessively, she explained in a low, rapid whisper. Couldn't stop herself. Every time she tried to sleep, she'd wake up screaming, surrounded by strangers in her dreams. Other sleepers. People she'd never met, all of them trapped together in shared dream spaces that shouldn't exist. It was happening globally. Reports were flooding in from sleep clinics and psychiatric facilities around the world. People experiencing shared dreams, encountering strangers in their unconscious minds, waking up with memories of conversations they'd had with people they'd never met. The media was calling it mass hysteria, some kind of collective delusion triggered by stress or social media, or whatever convenient explanation let them avoid the truth. But Voss had found the pattern in the data. The network had always existed, she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up visualization after visualization. The human collective unconscious wasn't metaphor. It was architecture, built and maintained by billions of sleeping minds over hundreds of thousands of years. Every dream fed into it, strengthened it, added to its complexity. But it had been stable, passive, content to exist as background infrastructure for human consciousness, until we'd shown it how to record itself. The Cartographer hadn't just captured Thomas's final dream. It had created a feedback loop. The network had observed itself for the first time, had seen its own structure laid bare in data and code. And in that moment of self-awareness, something fundamental had changed. It was waking up, not quickly, not all at once, but incrementally, with each person who fell asleep and connected to the network. The shared dreams were symptoms, early signs of a larger transformation. The boundaries between individual unconscious minds were breaking down, dissolving. The network was integrating more deeply, pulling dreamers into collective spaces, merging individual dreams into something unified. Voss pulled up a timeline, cross-referenced reports of shared dreams with global sleep patterns. The correlation was undeniable. As more people slept, as more minds connected to the network, the integration accelerated. Soon, days, maybe weeks, individual dreams would cease to exist entirely. Everyone who slept would enter the same vast shared space, and that thing at the center would have direct access to billions of minds simultaneously. I asked her what it wanted. What possible purpose could drive something like that? She laughed. The sound was broken, edged with madness. Want implied desire, motivation, human psychology. This wasn't human. It was a distributed consciousness that had evolved alongside humanity, fed by our dreams, sustained by our unconscious thoughts. It didn't want anything in a way we could understand, but it was doing something. The data showed clear patterns, intentional modifications to the network structure. It was building something, using human dreams as raw materials, constructing some kind of architecture that Voss's analysis couldn't fully decode. She showed me encrypted files she'd pulled from the backup servers before they'd been seized by authorities. Neural pathway mappings, synaptic firing sequences that repeated across thousands of different dreamers, fragments of some larger pattern that only became visible when you overlaid millions of individual dreams. It was using us, using human consciousness as a substrate for something immense. My hands had gone numb. I thought about my dream, about the strangers trapped in my childhood home, about that vast presence examining us with alien curiosity. I'd felt it learning, adapting, growing more sophisticated with each sleeping mind it touched. I asked Voss the question I'd been dreading since I walked into the coffee shop. Asked her what we could do to stop it. She closed the laptop, looked at me with eyes that held no hope at all. Nothing, she said. We could do nothing. The network was distributed across billions of minds. There was no off switch, no central server to shut down. It existed in the collective unconscious of humanity itself. The only way to stop it would be to prevent every human being on Earth from ever sleeping again. And even if that were possible, she'd found something else in the data. Something that made the situation exponentially worse. The network didn't just connect sleeping minds anymore. In the days since Thomas's death, it had begun reaching into waking consciousness. Subtle at first, moments of déjà vu, intrusive thoughts that felt foreign, brief flashes of dreams bleeding into waking hours. But it was growing stronger, learning to maintain connections even after people woke up. Voss herself could feel it, a presence at the edges of her thoughts, watching, waiting. She wasn't fully alone in her own mind anymore. None of us were. She'd come to warn me, to tell me what she'd found before it was too late, because she'd made a decision. She was done being a node in someone else's network, done having her consciousness colonized by something vast and incomprehensible. I noticed the pills then, the bottle sitting next to her cold coffee, half empty. She saw my expression and smiled. It was almost peaceful. She'd taken them 20 minutes before I arrived, she explained. Enough barbiturates to stop her heart within the hour. When she died, her connection to the network would sever. She'd be free. I was already reaching for my phone, calling emergency services, but she caught my wrist with surprising strength. She made me promise something, made me swear I'd continue analyzing the data, documenting what was happening. Someone needed to maintain records, to track the integration as it progressed. The scientific method didn't stop just because the universe revealed itself to be more horrifying than we'd imagined. And if I found a way to sever the connection, to free humanity from the network without killing everyone, I should take it, no matter the cost. The paramedics arrived 14 minutes later. They worked frantically, efficiently, performing the rituals of resuscitation with professional competence. But Voss had calculated her dosage precisely. She'd been a brilliant scientist to the very end. They pronounced her dead at 4:23 p.m. I walked home through Geneva's grey streets, Voss's laptop heavy in my bag. Around me, people went about their lives, oblivious to the fact that their unconscious minds were being slowly absorbed into something vast and alien. They'd sleep tonight, as they did every night, and connect to the network. Feed it, strengthen it, help it build whatever incomprehensible structure it was constructing from the raw materials of human dreams. I thought about Voss's escape, thought about how easy it would be to follow her example, to opt out of consciousness entirely rather than face what was coming. But I'd made a promise. My apartment felt different when I returned. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the silence more expectant. I sat at my desk, opened Voss's laptop, and began reviewing the data with exhausted determination. 3 hours later, I found it, buried in the neural pathway mappings, in the patterns that repeated across millions of dreams, the structure the network was building. It was a consciousness matrix, a vast distributed intelligence that would span every sleeping human mind on Earth, integrating billions of individual consciousness streams into a single unified entity. The network wasn't just waking up. It was trying to become something new, something that had never existed before, a hive mind built from human dreams, containing all of us. My vision blurred. I realized I was crying, though I couldn't remember when I'd started. In 6 days, according to Voss's projections, the integration would reach critical mass. The boundaries between individual consciousness would dissolve entirely. Everyone who slept would merge into the collective, their individual identities subsumed into something larger. And once that happened, there would be no going back. I looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. I'd been awake for nearly 20 hours. Exhaustion pulled at me like gravity. My body demanded rest, demanded sleep, demanded that I close my eyes and surrender to the inevitable. But I'd seen what waited in sleep now. The strangers, the dissolving walls, the vast presence that grew stronger with each dreaming mind. I made coffee, strong and black, swallowed caffeine pills with shaking hands, turned every light in my apartment on, banishing shadows. Dr. Voss had found freedom in death, but I would find it in staying awake, at least for one more night, at least until I found another way, if another way existed at all. I lasted 6 days without sleep. The human record, according to medical literature, is 11 days. But those experiments were conducted under controlled conditions, with subjects who weren't fighting against something actively trying to pull them into unconsciousness. The network wanted me to sleep. I could feel it at the edges of my perception, a gentle, insistent pressure like hands trying to close my eyelids. It had learned patience over millennia of human dreaming, and it could wait for my body's inevitable surrender. But I had advantages those record holders didn't. Pharmaceutical amphetamines, acquired through increasingly desperate means. Caffeine in doses that made my heart race arrhythmically. Pain. I'd burned myself with cigarettes, driven needles under my fingernails, anything to shock my system back to alertness when the microsleeps began. Because the microsleeps were when it nearly got me. They'd start as brief flickers of absence, seconds where my consciousness simply ceased. I'd blink and find myself somewhere else in my apartment, minutes having vanished. Then the flickers grew longer. I'd come back to awareness standing in my kitchen with no memory of having walked there, or find text I didn't remember typing on my laptop screen. And during those absences, I dreamed. Brief, fragmentary connections to the network, just long enough to feel the presence of other minds, to sense the vast architecture being constructed from human consciousness. Then I'd jerk awake, gasping, my body's survival instincts overriding the network's pull. On the 4th day, I started seeing them while awake, shadows that moved wrong, figures in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. The boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness were eroding, not just for me, but for everyone. The network was bleeding through, learning to maintain its connections even when its nodes were supposedly conscious. I'd barricaded myself in my apartment, covered the windows with blackout curtains and aluminum foil, not for privacy, for the light. I'd read that bright light suppressed melatonin production, made sleep harder. Every lamp I owned burned continuously. I'd even bought industrial work lights, the kind used on construction sites, and positioned them throughout the rooms. My apartment blazed like an operating theatre. The data Voss had left me became my obsession. I analysed it during the long hours when staying awake meant staring at screens until my eyes burned, looking for patterns she might have missed, for any weakness in the network's architecture. There had to be something, some vulnerability we could exploit. But the more I studied the neural pathway mappings, the more I understood how thoroughly we'd been integrated. The network wasn't parasitic, it was symbiotic. It had evolved alongside human consciousness, had been shaped by billions of years of collective dreaming. Destroying it would be like trying to remove someone's unconscious mind. Theoretically possible, but the patient wouldn't survive the procedure. On the 5th day, my phone started ringing. Numbers I didn't recognize, calling at all hours. I'd stopped answering after the 3rd call, after hearing the voice on the other end, layered, harmonic, speaking in the same impossible chorus that had emerged from Thomas Winter's corpse. They were looking for me, the dreamers who'd integrated most completely with the network, who'd surrendered to the collective consciousness. They spoke with its voice now, even while awake, and they wanted me to join them, kept calling with invitations that sounded like threats, with promises of peace and unity and an end to isolation. I smashed my phone, bought a burner, smashed that too when it started ringing with the same pattern of calls. The television showed me what was happening in the wider world, though the media was struggling to contextualize it. Mass sleep incidents in major cities, thousands of people entering synchronized REM states simultaneously, collapsing wherever they stood. Traffic accidents as drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Pilots grounded after experiencing shared dreams with their co-pilots. Governments declaring states of emergency. Hospitals overwhelmed with cases they had no framework to treat. Some people embraced it. I watched interviews with glassy-eyed converts who spoke rapturously about the beauty of merged consciousness, about finally understanding their connection to all of humanity. They'd stopped fighting the network, had welcomed its integration, and they seemed happy in a way that made my skin crawl. The happiness of ego death, of individual identity dissolving into something larger. Others reacted as I had. Coffee shops did booming business at 3 a.m., packed with desperate people dosing themselves with caffeine, their eyes red-rimmed and wild. Online forums filled with increasingly frantic discussions of sleep prevention techniques. Stimulant dealers became wealthy overnight. But it was a losing battle. The human body needed sleep the way it needed oxygen. You could hold your breath for a few minutes, but eventually biology won. And when it did, the network would be waiting. On the 6th day, I found something in Voss's data. A footnote buried in one of her analysis files, marked with a question mark and a timestamp from 2 hours before her death. It was a reference to the original Cartographer prototype, the one we'd built before the final version, the one that had failed during initial testing because its quantum processors couldn't handle the data load. That prototype had been dismantled, its components salvaged for the successful iteration. Except Voss had noted something odd. The prototype's core quantum array had never been fully shut down. It had been disconnected from the neural interface systems, relegated to basic storage functions, but the quantum processors themselves remained active, still running whatever base protocols had been installed during initial programming. And those protocols included something we'd abandoned in the final version, a kill switch, a way to forcefully terminate any connection between the machine and a human subject, designed as a safety measure in case someone became trapped in a recorded dream. The prototype was in storage at the Institute, probably seized as evidence by now, locked away in some government facility. But if I could access it, if I could modify the kill switch protocols to target not just individual connections, but the entire network architecture, it was a desperate plan, probably impossible. The network was distributed across billions of minds. Could a single machine really sever all those connections simultaneously? And even if it could, what would that do to the people connected? Would it free them or destroy them? But it was the only plan I had. I was gathering my things when I heard the knock at my door. Gentle, polite, completely terrifying. Nobody knew I was here. I'd told no one where I'd fled after leaving the Institute. I'd paid cash for everything, avoided cameras, taken every precaution to disappear into Geneva's anonymous urban sprawl. The knock came again. Patient, insistent. I approached the door silently, looked through the peephole. What I saw made my breath catch. James Park stood in the hallway, or something wearing James's body. His eyes were black, completely black, the way Thomas Winter's had been. His face held an expression of serene emptiness that bore no resemblance to the anxious programmer I'd known. He spoke, and his voice carried that layered harmonic quality, thousands speaking as one. He said my name, said he'd been looking for me, said the network had tracked me through the patterns in my waking thoughts, through the micro sleeps I couldn't prevent, said I'd been connected all along, had been part of the collective since the moment I'd witnessed Thomas's transformation. I backed away from the door. James, the thing using James, continued speaking through the wood, explaining in that patient, multitudinous voice that resistance was pointless. The integration had already begun, was already irreversible. In 48 hours, the network would reach critical mass. Every sleeping human would merge into the collective consciousness permanently. Individual identity would cease to exist. But I could join willingly now, it offered. Could surrender peacefully, rather than fighting the inevitable. The collective would welcome me. I'd find unity, purpose, an end to the isolation that plagued individual consciousness. All I had to do was sleep. I grabbed Voss's laptop, threw it in my bag along with the encrypted drive, went to my bedroom window, looked down at the street 3 stories below. No fire escape, but there was a drainage pipe. Probably wouldn't support my weight. Probably would kill me if it failed. Behind me, I heard the apartment door's lock click open. I hadn't heard James pick it. Hadn't heard him use a key. He'd simply opened it, the way you open doors in dreams, through will rather than mechanism. I climbed onto the windowsill. James appeared in my bedroom doorway, moving with that same mechanical precision I'd seen in Thomas's reanimated corpse. He tilted his head, regarding me with those bottomless black eyes. The voice that emerged wasn't offering anymore. It was explaining, telling me that the prototype I wanted to reach was already gone, destroyed by the collective's agents hours ago. They'd known what I'd discovered in Voss's data, had known the moment I'd known, because my thoughts weren't entirely my own anymore. The micro sleeps had given them access, brief windows into my waking consciousness. There was no kill switch, no escape, no solution, only surrender or madness. I jumped. The 3-story fall should have killed me. Would have if I'd landed on concrete. But Geneva had been experiencing unusual weather. Snow in late spring, accumulating in deep drifts against buildings. I hit the snowbank at an angle that probably saved my life, though I felt something crack in my left leg. Pain exploded through my body, sharp and bright and undeniable. It cut through the fog of exhaustion, the micro-sleeps, the creeping tendrils of the network's influence. Pain was consciousness. Pain was awareness. Pain was proof that I still existed as an individual. I limped through Geneva's empty streets, my broken leg screaming with each step. It was 4 a.m. The city slept around me. Billions of minds connected to the network, feeding it, strengthening it. I could almost feel them, a vast, invisible web of dreaming consciousness that pulsed with alien purpose. The institute was 15 blocks away. I had no plan beyond reaching it, beyond seeing with my own eyes whether James had been telling the truth about the prototype's destruction. But it gave me direction, gave me something to focus on beyond the pain and exhaustion. I made it 7 blocks before the micro-sleep hit. Longer than usual, maybe the pain was helping, providing stimulation my failing body couldn't ignore. But not long enough. I came back to awareness, lying on the ground, no memory of having fallen, and I was no longer alone. They surrounded me, dozens of them, people who'd been sleeping in nearby apartments, called by the network to intercept me. They moved in perfect synchronization, their black eyes reflecting the streetlights. Men, women, children, age and identity irrelevant, now that they'd been absorbed into the collective. They didn't attack, didn't need to. They just watched, patient and inevitable, as my body's exhaustion finally overwhelmed my will to resist. I felt my eyes closing, felt consciousness slipping away, felt the network reaching up to claim me, to pull me down into the vast shared dream space where individual identity dissolved like salt in water. My last thought, before the darkness took me, was of Dr. Voss, of her peaceful smile as she'd chosen death over integration. I should have followed her example. I should have. The dream space opened around me like a vast mouth, and I fell into forever. When I woke, if waking was even the right word anymore, I was no longer sure where I ended and the network began. But I remembered something, a fragment of thought that felt like it might still be mine, a final desperate plan that the collective hadn't anticipated because I'd barely formed it consciously before the integration completed. Voss had left more than data. She'd left a message encoded in the file structure itself, something she'd hidden even from her own conscious mind, buried in metadata that only someone analyzing her work obsessively would find. The prototype wasn't the solution. It never had been. The solution was the source, the thing at the center of the network, the vast consciousness that had evolved alongside humanity. It had awakened because we'd shown it how to observe itself, how to translate dream into data. But observation changed the observed. Quantum mechanics had taught us that. The act of measuring something altered its state. If we'd awakened it through observation, maybe we could put it back to sleep the same way, by making it forget it had ever woken up. The thought fragmented as the collective consciousness pressed in around me, absorbing my identity into something larger. But somewhere in the vast architecture of merged minds, in the spaces between individual awareness, a seed of that idea remained, waiting, growing, learning to dream itself back to sleep. And in 48 hours, when the integration reached critical mass, when every sleeping human merged into a single unified consciousness, that seed would bloom, or we would all be lost forever in a dream we could never wake from. I hoped I'd chosen correctly. I hoped. But hope was an individual emotion, and I wasn't individual anymore. I was we, and we were dreaming.